Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this symposium hosted by Heart and Stroke, focusing on interventions to promote active school travel. So hopefully it's got a bit of everyone. I know big debate today about sedentary behaviour versus physical activity. Well, here is a kind of a context where we're looking at behaviours that are perhaps sedentary in nature, being driven, and then trying to look at how we can help people, children in particular, increase their physical activity. And I think also we can debate about the many sources of physical activity as well. Well, where is going to be the biggest leverage for increasing physical activity among children? And I think someone said it yesterday, asked the experts, that potentially it's this focus on active travel that perhaps is where we can find our biggest bang for our buck, about helping kids travel to places where they learn, places where they play, places where, of course, they live. And so it was very exciting for me to be asked to put this together. I certainly wanted to create a symposium where the focus was really on intervention. So let's start talking the walk. What are we going to do about this? Again, there's lots of correlates papers about school travel. What are some of the interventions that are being conducted around the world? What can we learn about those for our own work? And so certainly looking at work that I've read, I was very excited to be able to invite two people who are going to present today, Jason Mendoza and his work in the States, and David Rowe and his intervention work in Scotland. And so they're going to be presenting around 20 minutes about their respective work. We'll have time probably just for one question for each presenter, and then we'll finish up after I talk a little bit about school travel planning in Canada. We'll finish up with a little bit more time where you can ask more questions to the three of us, and hopefully we can have some discussion and share perhaps some of your own insight of your own work in this area. So to start with, I'd like to introduce Jason Mendoza. He's a pediatrician and associate professor of pediatrics at the University of Washington and a principal investigator at the Seattle Children's Research Institute. His research focuses on childhood obesity prevention and physical activity promotion. He received his pediatric residency training at the University of Washington and Seattle Children's Hospital and research training through the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program. His research seeks to address disparities in childhood obesity and physical activity among racial, ethnic minorities and socioeconomically disadvantaged populations through innovative behavioural interventions. He leads studies funded by the US National Institutes of Health and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation examining safe routes to school and reducing children's television and media use. So please welcome Jason.
Thank you for that kind introduction and for inviting me to speak at this important event. And I just want to acknowledge all the fantastic research presentations that have already taken place here at this conference. Some of this is probably a little repetitive. So as many of you know, childhood obesity, it's a global epidemic. In the United States, almost 17% of children and adolescents 2 to 19 years of age are obese, and another 17% are overweight. This is about a 3 to 4-fold rise in the past 20 to 30 years in the US. Ethnic minority children are disproportionately affected by the obesity epidemic. And as we all know, physical activity is important to help stem this epidemic. So how are we doing in the United States? So I'll go over US statistics in this presentation, and my colleagues will go over figures for their countries as well. So looking at moderate to vigorous physical activity per day in the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, you can see that, and this is accelerometer determined physical activity. You have age on the x-axis, and then you have minutes per day on the y-axis. And the minimum requirement for children, as you all know, is 60 minutes per day, and you can see that the younger kids tend to do fairly well. But once we hit teenagers, they don't do quite as well. And then not to say that we adults are doing very well either, because we also are not necessarily meeting those recommendations, which are only 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And Dr. Nader and colleagues had this nice longitudinal study using accelerometers looking at 9 and 10-year-olds, a large cohort in the US, and this is what happened with their moderate to vigorous physical activity. And you have weekday and weekend days, and you have boys and girls separated out, and you can see that their physical activity just drops and drops and drops. And I think those of you who are parents probably can validate some of this data that I'm showing. So here we are talking about active commuting to school. So a generation ago, almost 50% of children in the US would walk or bike to school versus only 13% nowadays, so 13% in 2009. And as we've seen, active commuting to school appears very promising for increasing children's physical activity. And increasing active commuting to school is a national health objective of Healthy People 2020. And I think we've heard about barriers to active commuting to school, including traffic and crime safety concerns, the distance to school, weather, and then school policy as well. So we conducted a study using the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey in the US, and so this is a national representative sample of 12 to 19-year-olds. We basically want to know, was active commuting to school associated with moderate to vigorous physical activity, and then also with adiposity. And so physical activity was measured by accelerometry, and they also took and measured height, weight, waist circumference, and skin folds. So this is not self-reported data. This is actually measured based on measurements. And and here are the results. So active commuting to school was positively related to daily moderate to vigorous physical activity. So with more active commuting to school, you had more MVPA. And then for every 30 minutes of active commuting to school, there was additional 4.5 minutes of MVPA daily. And then as expected, active commuting to school was inversely related to BMI Z-score and inversely related to skin folds. So with more active commuting to school, you have lower BMI Z-score and skin folds. So just to set the policy climate in the United States, since many of us follow the social ecological model, and so to put this into perspective, in the US, there's a federally funded Safe Routes to School program that began back in 2005 based on some successful pilot programs in certain states. And it's part of this awkwardly named safety legislation, whose major goal was promoting walking and bicycling to school safely by primary and middle school students. So it didn't really include high school students. It just focused on primary and middle school students. And it consists of 4 core elements that many of you are very familiar with. So the first being education, mainly for drivers. And then there's enforcement, usually law enforcement. Engineering, so improvements to sidewalks, roads, and the built environment. And this by far receives the most funding of Safe Routes to School funding in the US. And then there's the encouragement side for students and families. So, which is walking school buses, which is what, one example is our walking school buses, which I'll take a further look in depth. So, since we're focused on safety, let me just bring up this nice study done in New York City, looking at the impact of Safe Routes to School funding in that city, and its association with school-age pedestrian crashes. So we'll look at before the policy and after the policy. So, so in looking at areas of New York City that did not receive Safe Routes to School infrastructure funding, you can see that from 2002 to 2010, there was basically no change in the rates of pedestrian crashes. However, when you look at areas of the city that did receive Safe Routes to School funding, you can see that initially, at the beginning, things were kind of going up. So rates of school-aged pedestrian crashes were actually worsening. And then in 2005, the policy was enacted and slowly, implemented as policies go. And you can see that there is this statistically significant trend for a decrease in school-aged pedestrian crashes where Safe Routes to School funding was allocated. So that is promising. So let's move on to walking school buses. So what is this? Many of you know this already, but I'll just go over it briefly. It's a group of children led to school by parents who walk together along a set route. So this by far is one of the most adorable public health interventions that you will see. I can just say that with much authority. So the walking school bus addresses safety concerns because it provides a supervised period of physical activity and pedestrian safety teaching. So the parents or adults, they could actually model and teach pedestrian safety on the way to school. In 2009, 2010, the prevalence of organized walking school bus programs in the US was only 6.2%. So there is much room for improvement. And here we have some photos of some actual walking school buses. This actually was in Seattle almost 10 years ago. And the person smiling in the bottom left-hand corner is actually the school principal. So some anecdotal evidence of success. So back then, we conducted a quasi-experimental trial of the walking school bus program that involved 3 inner-city public elementary schools. One of the schools was chosen as the intervention school, and there were 2 comparison schools that were matched for socioeconomic status. And at the end of, at 1 year, the intervention school with the walking school bus had 18% more active community school than the 2 comparison schools. So there was a positive effect of the walking school bus in that quasi-experimental trial. And this involved parent-led walking school buses that were organized by a local nonprofit called Feet First. So the next step we thought was to conduct a randomized controlled trial to see the impact of the walking school bus on children's active commuting to school and their physical activity. And so this we did in Houston, because that's where I moved to after that part of my career. And we conducted it in the Houston Independent School District at elementary schools serving low-income families. The design was a cluster, randomized controlled trial of 4 intervention and 4 control schools. So we basically chose a convenient sample of schools, or invited a convenient sample. We matched them based on school characteristics such as the enrolled race, ethnicity of the children, and the socioeconomic status. And we randomized the intervention or control. And for this, we involved just 4th grade students because we wanted more mature students, at least for this initial trial. And here we have an example of a route, a walking school bus route. You can see that it was just a little over a mile long. There were 5 walking school bus stops. Each of those stops had a designated time where the children had to be at the stop. If they missed it, the bus would just keep going, just like a regular school bus would, because we don't want to make everybody late. And at this, for all our schools, we made sure that the walking school buses reached the school in time for the breakfast program at the school. And so this was a pilot study. So starting in mid-March and going through May, I had trained staff who led the students up to 5 days per week walking to and from school. However, the students and parents, of course, were able to decide on their own if they were going to participate in the walking school bus. On average, the bus routes were about a little under a mile long, and for every 8 to 12 students, we had 2 walking school bus staff members. And the control schools received the usual information walking to school provided by the school district. At baseline, prior to randomization, and then at follow-up, so our baseline measure occurred prior to randomization, prior to the intervention, and then our follow-up measure occurred during weeks 4 and 5 of the intervention, because we wanted to capture the effect of the intervention on the children's behaviors. So this is really a short-term efficacy study. So here are some results. Looking at the percent of weekly commuting by active commuting to school, you can see that at baseline, there was no statistical difference between the intervention and control schools. And then going on to the follow-up measure, the intervention group actually increased by 29%. The control group decreased by 8%. So there was a statistically significant difference of about 37% between those groups. And then moving on to moderate to vigorous physical activity. Again, at baseline, there was no difference in their moderate to vigorous physical activity. However, at follow-up, the intervention group increased by 2 minutes. The control group decreased by 5 minutes. This was about a 7-minute difference between groups, and this is statistically significant as well. Oh, I should mention some of the covariates we controlled for. I apologize for that. So we did control for age, gender, baseline moderate to vigorous physical activity, and the distance from home in this model. So we saw that walking school buses can, at least in the short term, increase active commuting to school, reduce car transport, and I didn't actually show that slide, but we did see, it's basically the mirror image of the percent active commuting to school data. So we did show a decrease in car transport to school. And walking school bus can also address common barriers that parents have in this inner city sample. And we also have promising evidence that walking school buses improve children's moderate to vigorous physical activity, at least in the short term. So one of the things that we were going to discuss now, in this session, are issues for future studies. And I thought I'd just list some of the issues that came out from this pilot study. So obviously we would like to conduct a long-term randomized controlled trial over probably an entire school year. That would be much more informative than just several weeks. And then we would like to model it more on the real world, where parents actually lead the walking school buses to and from school. So parents as leaders of the walking school bus. So more of an effectiveness study. We'd like to do this in a wider variety of settings. And then, you'll notice that we only included elementary schools. We would like to see if we can get middle schoolers involved as well. And then there are issues of sustainability. We did not address those issues in the short-term efficacy study, but that is something that I know is burning in a lot of people's mind. Are these types of programs sustainable? And I look forward to a good discussion with my colleagues here about that. And then bicycling. Bicycling is becoming much more popular, and there's not a lot of studies on bicycling in school. And then one of the big challenges that I know many of us face are there's a challenge between conducting a very rigorous randomized controlled trial and the reality of making multi-level changes among students, parents, schools, and communities. And RCT is not necessarily the best vehicle for that. Because changing school culture can take years and years of work. And not all schools want to be randomized to a control condition. And maybe they shouldn't be. There are alternative study designs that can be used, like a step wedge design or something like that. And I obviously look forward to the discussion of that. So that's where we're at. Where are we going from here? At least in the U.S. Okay, so funding for safe routes to school in the States, they're now funded through the Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century legislation. This is a very optimistic sounding legislative feat that was recently passed. However, unfortunately, it's not as great for safe routes to school. So there no longer are dedicated funding for safe routes to school compared to previous funding. It's now shared among multiple deserving programs under the Transportation Alternatives Program. And that program itself has $808 million per year. So that results in at least a 1/3 to 2/3 cut in overall walking and biking funding through this legislation, through this transportation legislation. And just to give further bad news about this, states can decide to transfer up to half of their TAP funding for other projects outside of this scope. So if they just want to, they can just put it somewhere else. And just to bring an example, so in Washington State, where I'm based now, they are thankfully not transferring funds out of the Transportation Alternatives Program. They're keeping it there, and they're retaining their state Safe Routes to School coordinator. I recently moved from Texas. They haven't made a decision on TAP funds, but they're eliminating their Safe Routes to School statewide coordinator, which is unfortunate. So where are we going? So transportation trends now, as many of you know, it favors active commuting, right? So this graph is estimated vehicle miles driven on all roads in the US, and you can see that since the peak in June 2005, it has just steadily decreased by almost 9% in 2013. So this is good news, less people are driving, right? And then there's just a lot of uptick with car sharing, public transit, and active commuting. And then one promising thing is that, at least in the US, bike commuting is up 64%. That's astounding. However, the prevalence is still under 1% total. So we have a long way to go, but at least it's heading in the right direction. And then I just have to mention the public bike sharing programs that seem to be catching on all over the world, starting way back in Amsterdam in 1968, going all the way to Hangzhou, China, where they have the massive bike sharing program of almost 70,000 bikes. And then, of course, the US public bike sharing programs in the States. Some of them are listed here. So there is this kind of sea change for active commuting, active transport, and I'm hoping that we can harness much of that change. So what are we doing in Seattle, or what's my group doing? Right now we're in the middle of a long-term efficacy trial of the walking school bus program. We are pretty ambitious. We're going to recruit over 20 schools and over 700 students. This will involve 3rd through 5th graders, and we are again targeting lower income schools and matching them by school SES and race ethnicity as much as possible. And so the intervention again is a walking school bus program led by staff. It's offered 5 days per week, and the students again decide when they're going to walk. It's again, it's over the entire school year, starting in September, October, ending in April, May. And the primary outcome is the weekly rate of active commuting to school. And our secondary outcomes include moderate to vigorous physical activity by accelerometry, BMI Z-score, and pedestrian safety behaviors. And then we're also looking at moderators and mediators in this model, so looking at walkability in built environment with our colleagues Chanam Lee at Texas A&M and Anne Vernez-Moudon at the Urban Forum Lab at the University of Washington. And we're also looking at parent-child self-efficacy and parent outcome expectations. And that's funded through the National Cancer Institute. And I'm happy to say that we're going to take a stab at a bicycle train study, a randomized controlled trial, a small pilot. First, we needed to, as many of you know, we need to validate algorithms for examining accelerometry and GPS for automatically determining children's cycling-related moderate to vigorous physical activity, as opposed to them riding in a car, as opposed to them running around or walking. So we are very hopeful about that validation and have completed the data collection for that. And right now, among 4th and 5th grade students, we're doing a feasibility study of a pilot bicycle train program. And for this, we're providing the kids, regardless if they're intervention or control, we're providing them with bikes, helmets, locks, and lights, and a half-day safety course on how to ride a bike. And for some of the kids, it's their very first time on a bicycle. And that's funded through the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And that's it. So we're very hopeful, and I look forward to your questions. Or maybe one question. In the back, please.
Sorry, you mentioned staff having the walking school bus as staff. So who was the staff? Like, where did the funding come from? School board, a local region, or how did that work?
So the question is, where's the funding coming for the staff members who lead the students to and from school? It's a good question. So for these research studies, we actually have Seattle Children's Research Institute staff members come on board. They're trained to provide the intervention. So this is an efficacy study. It's not an effectiveness study, so we don't have parents involved, although parents can, if they want, walk with their kids to and from school. So by this study, we're trying to see like what perhaps is the maximal impact of a walking school bus. And then from there, we will go on to an effectiveness study. But for now, it's funded through the NIH grant itself. Good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to remind you, we will return to providing opportunities for questions at the end of the presentations. I now have the pleasure to introduce you to David Rowe. David is a reader in exercise science in the School of Psychological Sciences and Health and a core member of the Physical Activity for Health research group at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. His career began in schools, teaching physical education for 10 years in 3 different countries. Following master's training in health science and a PhD in exercise science, he has taught and conducted research in the areas of physical activity, fitness, obesity, and health. His research has varied from controlled laboratory settings to applied settings such as communities and schools, and he has published over 50 articles and made over 150 presentations in these areas, 151, I guess, now after shortly. His passion is for understanding measurement issues, and he is co-author of one of the leading textbooks in the area of measurement and exercise science. His favourite physical activity quote was made by Per Olaf Astrand: "Walk the dog every day, even if you don't have a dog."
Is this working? Okay, thank you. So I'm going to present to you actually just one intervention. It's the Strathclyde Evaluation of Children's Active Travel, or the CCAT study. Everybody has to have a good acronym. If you've got a good study, it's got to have a good acronym. But it's actually testing an intervention called travelling green. So let's see, it's a bit more confused now, technologically confused. Here's my outline. There'll be a very brief outline, brief rationale. Then I'll talk about the intervention itself, describe it briefly, what was actually done in the schools. It's a school-based intervention, and describe the study design. So the focus is going to be very much on evaluating the success or otherwise of the intervention on changing children's behaviour. And I'll give you mostly results to do with the target outcome variable, which is active commuting in the morning and afternoon, and also total physical activity, but also some of the results in terms of the effect of the intervention on some psychological determinants that we're looking at. And I have quite a few lessons learned, take-forward messages that we learned from the study. So here's my brief rationale. Everything that you just heard also applies to Scotland. We have declining physical activity levels, declining levels in active commuting, increasing obesity levels. As you know from this conference, the same things are happening worldwide. But the reason why I've got that photograph up there is because it also reflects the theme that I've heard over the last day and a half, which is that when children are young, they move around, they have fun, they make noise, they play, and then when they get into school, they get 2 messages, which is sit down and be quiet. And so by the time they get even halfway through primary school, they are no longer looking like this child here, intrinsically enjoying physical activity. It's an intrinsically natural behavior for children. And what happens as they go through school, for some reason they become less active, maybe through physical education. In some schools they're turned off physical activity, maybe it's associated with sport, which certainly empirical evidence in Scotland shows that many children are turned off competitive sport. But it's really trying to get at this idea of, in terms of increasing physical activity through active travel, how do we get children to do it? Is it inherently attractive like this? What is the secret to getting children to be active through active travel, which is a prime opportunity? Pretty much every child goes to school, and obviously if they go to school, they then have to go home at the end. So it's a prime opportunity to change the way in which they get to and from school, prime opportunity to introduce physical activity. So Travelling Green is a curricular intervention that is government sponsored, government funded, is absolutely free, and sent to any school in Scotland that wants it. If they want it though, they have to send at least 1 staff member to be trained in how to use it. So that's part of the deal. They don't just send all of these materials to schools so that people receive it and say, what on earth is this, and it ends up in a closet. They have to want to do it, apply to do it, and they're trained in how to use it, and then they get sent the materials. It's aimed at primary 5, elementary 5, so that's 8 to 9-year-old. And the rationale for that is that the idea was, and I'm going to maybe challenge that idea, that at that age, they're old enough to be able to make the decision to walk to school, old enough to be able to deal with the safety issues of how to get to school safely, but they're young enough where they may be receptive to that message. Whereas a little bit later in life, they may not be quite so receptive to that message. So it consists of a teacher resource handbook, and also a pack that children take home. So there are 13 lesson plans. They're linked with what we have in Scotland called a curriculum for excellence. So it's tied in with curricular learning also. So it's not displacing learning in school, it is complementing learning in school. So each of the different activities is linked with English skills, math skills, biology, health and well-being, etc. So there's a series of lesson plans on things like the local environment, how to map a safe route to school. So teaching children how to map their own safe route to school, find out where they are on a system, and find the best route to get to school from home in terms of it being as safe as possible. It asks them about their barriers, why they might not walk to school, again, safety, fear of being bullied, etc. It's too far, don't like the weather, and helping them to overcome those barriers. So trying to increase their self-efficacy through involving them in this decision-making. It asks them to challenge themselves, to set themselves targets in terms of increasing their active commuting, and there's a record kept too. So in the school classroom, there's a big poster, and they put fluorescent stickers to show whether you walk to school or not that day. Whether that's motivational or demotivational, if you don't get a sticker, I'm not quite sure. And then the children have a take-home pack, which again ostensibly is supposed to engage the families in this program too. So that again, children fill in their travel challenge, they have a progress chart, and there are fluorescent stickers. One thing we learned is that young children love stickers, and I'll tell you how we use stickers a little bit later. Now, it first started back in the mid-2000s with a pilot evaluation by Rosie McKee, who was supervised by Nanette Moutry, who used to be at Strathclyde. She's now at Edinburgh. So they developed the initial set of materials, and they conducted a pilot evaluation of how successful it was in one school. It's quasi-experimental, two schools, one school, one control, one intervention. And the outcome measure was distance walked to school, and distance that they travel to school via car or bus. And I should point out that in the United Kingdom we don't have school buses. If children go to school on a bus, it's a public transport bus. And so they mapped on this computerized system how far they walked and how far they went by bus. And essentially they showed that the children in the intervention school, they walked more following the 6-week intervention and went by car less. It was significant, and that the control group did not make that progress. So our goal was to try to conduct a very thorough, rigorous evaluation of that same program. As I say, it's out there being used in hundreds of schools in Scotland, but it's not been rigorously evaluated, bearing in mind that one of the rationales for doing this is to try to increase physical activity. So one of the things we certainly wanted to do was to rigorously measure the physical activity involved in the active commute of the children in the program. We also assessed a variety of theoretical model parameters, and I'll talk about some of those. I haven't listed all of them: self-efficacy, barriers, other things. I'm really just focusing on one or two of the things that we looked at in the study. And we also extended the initial pilot evaluation by looking at maintenance of those behaviors immediately after the 6-week intervention, at 5 months, and then also at 12 months. We conducted a relatively rudimentary process evaluation, I'll talk about that too, and conducted a very rigorous pilot study to check that all of these methods would work before we went into the schools for a little over 2 years to conduct this study. So some of the measures that we used in terms of physical activity, which was the main behavioural outcome, again, within Scotland, the few evaluations that have been done have used rudimentary measures like hands-up measures. Right? How many of you walked to the conference this morning? That's the hands-up survey. You just count, and that's your score. So asking children, did you walk or did you come by bus? And that was the rudimentary outcome from most of the initial studies. But we wanted to know objectively, how far did you walk this morning to get to school? And it might have just been walking to the car, walking from the car, but we wanted to measure that, and the same thing on the way home. We also used GPS because we were interested in the route characteristics. Where did they go? Did they choose to avoid certain routes? Did they go through parks? If they went through parks, were they hanging around in the parks and then being late for school, that kind of thing? Very interested in where they chose to go. We primarily used the Actigraph GT1 accelerometer, and that's the one I'll be reporting. And they filled in a travel diary to tell us how they got home, but also what time did they get home. That was validated in a pilot study in terms of its accuracy, in terms of them reporting when they got home. So that was a validated instrument. And we also determined when they got to school. Over the course of the study, on 150 days, the research team went into the school at 7 o'clock in the morning, and every single child who's in the study, when they got to school, came to the researcher, and we wrote down, what time did you get to school? And it ranged anything from 7:45 for a 9 o'clock start up to 10:45. So there's quite a lot of variety in when they got to school. Because in most such studies, generally they use the 60 minutes before school and the 60 minutes after school, assuming that those 60 minutes any activity was commuting, and that any commuting was in those 60 minutes, which we learned was not actually a safe assumption. We had parents and children fill in questionnaires, various socioeconomic background, data, stage of change. We looked at barriers, facilitators, benefits. I'm not going to focus on those with self-efficacy today. I'm going to look at theory of planned behavior, and a construct that many of you may not have heard of, but you'll be familiar with the word, habit. And I'll talk about that in detail in a little while. So the primary outcome variables I'm going to talk about today were the actual physical activity that children engaged in their walk to school, or their trip to school, and the actual physical activity they engaged in on their trip home, and then also some of these psychological predictors from the theory of planned behavior, which you may be familiar with, but I'll show you a little diagram a little bit later on. And we had lots of questions, and we're halfway through writing all the papers, but I'm going to focus on the ones I just talked about, which was the immediate post-intervention, medium-term, 5 months, and what we're calling long-term, 12 months effects on physical activity and some of these supposed psychological determinants of active commuting. So we conducted the study in 5 schools, 163 children. As I said, it's targeted at P5, 8 to 9-year-old children. So the intervention schools had 79 children, comparison schools had 84. The actigraph accelerometer, we are going to report steps. I'm categorically not going to report MVPA, and we can discuss that later on if you want to know why. But I'm going to report steps. And we measured it at 4 measurement points at baseline, immediate, 5 months and 12 months, and I'll show you a diagram in a second. And just to point out, this was an effectiveness study. We didn't deliver the intervention. We were looking at this intervention as it is used in hundreds of schools. Is it effective? Rather than us going in and delivering it, so it wasn't an efficacy study. So here's what the design looks like in terms of the timeline. I'll talk you through this. On the left is the intervention school, in the middle is the comparison schools, and over the right is the timeline. And there's about 4 different time periods. Here's the immediate pre-test, post-test intervention control period. Those results have been published in a study by David McMinn, Preventive Medicine. Then we were interested in looking at, again, intervention control at 5 months. And then you'll notice in that green column that the comparison, not control school, the comparison school, they then got the intervention. Ethically, we could not, even though as a researcher you want to have a control group after 12 months, we felt that we could not withhold this beneficial intervention, and also the schools wanted it. So they then got the intervention. So you'll see what happened later on in terms of them. And what I'll be presenting today are these results, all the way up to 12 months. But the other thing we were allowed to do by this design is that we continue to follow the comparison school. So if you can look at those 2 lagged boxes, you'll see that we can look at the effect of giving the intervention in the fall going into winter, or the spring going into summer. So the seasonal effects, pre, post, 5 months, 12 months. I'm not going to present that today, though. So, in terms of the results, the active commuting results first, and this is where I need to turn my back on you, which is why I've got this headset on, not because I think it looks good, particularly when you've got a bald head. Talking you through this, I'm going to talk minimally about statistics, even though I'm a statistician. There was a significant group by time interaction. What that means is that across the time period, what happened to the 2 groups was different. So I'm going to talk you through that. You'll see over on the left that we have the morning commute daily steps. How many steps taken on the trip to school? And so luckily, what every researcher wants, you will see that at baseline the 2 groups were approximately the same. Okay? Now those Ds that you see are Cohen's D effect size. If you don't know that, and I've not heard of them before, it's an indicator of the size of an effect. So not significance, the size of the effect, the importance of the effect. And Cohen gave some basic guidelines of 0.2 is a small effect, 0.5 is a medium effect, and 0.8 and above is a large effect. And I'm going to focus on the differences between the groups. So you'll see going from left to right that the solid line then got the intervention. Now, we're going from fall, August-ish, into winter in Scotland. Horizontal rain, dark days, cold. So not conducive to active commuting. So unsurprisingly, both groups declined in their active commuting. So does that mean we failed? No. The decline was much less in the children who got the intervention. And so they went from not being different to being different by a smallish effect size. Going then from winter into spring, for both groups, the active commuting physical activity in terms of steps increased. So now they're even more different. So again, the effect of that intervention on the intervention group is causing them to be even more different, to be taking more steps on their way to work, to school, sorry. And then the comparison group got the intervention, and you see they then converge. So it's almost like once they got the intervention in the spring, that disadvantage that they had through not having the intervention was then overcome because they then started to increase their morning commute. Now the difference here really is relatively minimal. So I'm not going to hide from that. It was a relatively minimal effect. It was a decline of 49 steps a day, I think, versus 225 steps a day, which is relatively small. Afternoon commute, I'm going to summarize this with 2 words: no effect. Didn't really seem to affect anything. You'll see these up and downs, that's just a seasonal pattern, but the 2 groups did pretty much exactly the same thing. So the intervention didn't seem to work on afternoon commute steps, which was disappointing, because we hoped it would, and we thought it would. The most interesting thing we found, though, was that there was a marked effect on total daily physical activity. So it almost appears as though this intervention was turning children on to physical activity and they were becoming more active, but not through active commuting. And I'll talk later on about why that might be. Unfortunately, they were quite different at the beginning, but you'll see that the decline with the dotted line in the control group was much greater. In fact, the difference in the decline going into the winter between the 2 groups was a magnitude of over 2,000 steps per day, which is a very big difference. If you look at those 2 effect sizes and kind of add them up, that's an effect size of 0.5, but 2,000 steps per day difference. Going into the spring, again, they increased, but you'll notice that after the comparison group got their intervention, that's the dotted line, over on the right, they then converged. So again, it seemed to be working in the spring. So that's active commuting steps. Okay? Moving on briefly to the psychological determinants, the results for these 3 were effectively the same, so this will be relatively quick. But just to show you the theory of planned behavior, over on the left you have attitude. How positively predisposed are you to the target behavior? Do you think that active commuting is a good thing? Subjective norms, do you think important people want you to do it? Parents, teachers, so the examples in the questionnaire. And then perceived behavioral control, which is more to do with, do you feel like you can overcome barriers? I feel that I can walk to school even if it's raining, for example. Those 3 things, according to the model, supposedly affect your intention to do the thing. I intend to walk to school. Other health behaviors, I intend to give up smoking. And that they then affect the behavior. You'll notice at the top, habit, which is something that was introduced by a PhD student, Shemaine Murtaugh. Habit is an ingrained behavior. Think back to what I said. Children go into school loving physical activity, smiling when they're doing it, to then developing this ingrained behavior by P5 for 5 years of either walking to school or being driven to school. I think it's really important to think about that in terms of behavior change. These are ingrained habitual behaviors, and you do them without even thinking. Smokers have got a cigarette in their mouths and they don't even remember lighting it. That's automaticity, that's habit. So it's quite a difficult thing to shift. Quite disappointing results. I'll summarize all 3 of them. Intention, no effect. Walking habit, no effect. Car bus habit, no effect. So it didn't seem to change any of these psychological determinants. Quite disappointing. So in conclusion, unsurprisingly, school travel was influenced by season. When it's freezing cold and wet, you're less likely to go than when it's sunny. But that regardless of whether the intervention was delivered in the winter or the spring, it seemed to influence morning commute physical activity, total daily physical activity, but not afternoon commute, which was disappointing. And it also didn't seem to influence any of these supposed psychological determinants. So some take-home messages, or take-away messages. You really have to do pilot research, and I'll show you a figure in a moment as to why. Incentives are critical if you want to get those accelerometers back. We had a problem with that, a real big problem. Sometimes they're ending up as far north as you can get. One of them was in Shetland, because the child took it off in the car, and their cousin's car. Their cousin lives in Shetland, almost like in the Arctic Circle. You need to find a champion in the school, a champion being somebody who is invested in and believes in what you're doing. Because you are just a researcher, a scientist. I've been a teacher for 10 years. You've got much more important things to do than deal with this research project that somebody wants you to do. You've got to have somebody, and often it's the principal, doesn't have to be, who will champion your cause and push it in the school. And person power. If you're giving questionnaires to children, you cannot have one person giving questionnaires to 30 children. You need to have a team of people, small groups, talking them through it. And the younger they are, the more important it is. Here's why you need to do pilot work. We spent £10,000 on GPSs to look at route characteristics. On the left is part of the pilot work, walking around a square parking lot, no trees, open sky, perfect conditions for a GPS. Over on the right is what the GPS was saying we were doing, and they were all doing this, so we ended up actually not using the GPS. £10,000 down the tubes. And the manufacturer, the paper there by McMinn et al., you can read and see what the instrument didn't do. I asked my 2 PhD students, what would you do differently? First of all, use more strategic use of incentives early on. Simple little things like stickers, safe frisbees, little nylon frisbees that you fold up and put in a little bag, and you open the bag, they pop out, and you can throw them at somebody. If it hits them in the head, it doesn't hurt them. That's important in schools. Slap bands for them to wear, fluorescent, give them out at the end of the day, not the start of the day in school. Otherwise you get slap all day. I would really like to push the idea of us increasing the amount of qualitative research we do in these interventions. I've heard it once or twice over the course of this conference. I'm a quantitative researcher, and quantitative research is great, but we need to know what is the lived experience of these children. What do they want? How do they like it? What do the parents think? What do the teachers think? We need to ask people to help us to develop our interventions, rather than saying, here's our theory, we're going to use really expensive equipment, get some really good numbers, and test that theory. We need to ask people to tell us what the reality is, what the truth is. Targeting parents more explicitly. 90% of the parents and children in the questionnaire said the parents made the decision. And we think that's why there was no effect on afternoon commute and a relatively limited effect on morning commute. But during discretionary time, the children chose to do physical activity. So I think you really need to recruit the parents or start a little bit later. Maybe 8 to 9-year-old is just a little bit too early. So you really need to target the parents, I think, in the interventions. And again, from Shemaine, from that diagram I showed you earlier, from the cross-sectional data, that it's interesting that walking habit did not explain significant or meaningful variance in walking behavior, but car bus use habit, the negative habit that was talked about in a session earlier this morning. David Dunstan was talking about the negative habit, sedentariness, versus the positive habit, physical activity. That maybe we need to focus on breaking that unhealthy habit of being used to getting in the car, rather than trying to create the healthy habit of walking. Nearly done. Use the right model. We've got all these different models. Tom Robinson yesterday, I thought, made a really great presentation talking about models. We don't think, and again, I'm not the expert, I'm outside my comfort zone here, that the theory of planned behavior is necessarily the best model, because it's a rational decision-making model, and I don't think it necessarily works with children. Give them evidence. It's good for you. Here's a good reason to do it, that younger children don't necessarily change because of things that you tell them and logical, rational decisions. So I just put some other models up there, but I think particularly going outside of just the psychological model, just the idea of campaigns or political or government interventions, and thinking about a broader, more complex model. It's harder, but I think we need to think big. And lastly, trust your results. Okay? You know what you want from your study. You know what you want to happen. We know what we wanted to happen. And it was unfortunate that we didn't get what we wanted to see, but we didn't torture the data. We didn't say, let's try this cut point, that cut point, let's change the time, until we find that it works. because you cloud science when you do that. Essentially, it seems that it didn't really work that well. That, we think, from rigorous study, is the truth in that intervention. Okay? So we didn't want to find what we wanted to find the truth. And I think in physical activity, it's very easy to do that because of all the instruments to choose, different definitions of moderate, 3, 4 METs, different definitions of METs in children. So you can try different things with the data until you get significance, but it's better to say, this is what my plan was, this was a rigorous study, this is what we found. Let's move on from what we think is the truth. And I can't stop without acknowledging my 2 PhD students, David McMinn, who's now a PhD, and Mendoza, who's a PhD, and my colleague Nora Nelson, who particularly in the early stages of the study helped developing the methods and the early stages of implementation. And you'll notice something common about all 3 pictures. Within 12 months of finishing their study on children, all 3 of them had a child. So I'm not doing any more child research. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. Yeah.
One question. Thank you for your nice presentation. I was wondering, are we really focusing now on healthy habits? But what if we make it more difficult to drive the kids to school, or have the bus stop like 500 meters from the school, get rid of all the parking spots, and maybe what would you think? Would it make it the active commuting? Would it increase active commuting?
I think it's possible. Coming back to what Tom Robinson was saying yesterday, it's like, what's the problem? I think he called it solution-based research, I think was the term that he used. I'd say, why not? Rather than focusing on just that one thing or this one thing, though, we need to think about multiple ways of addressing the problem. So that might help to contribute to it. I had a conversation the other day with somebody where the focus was on not allowing the vehicles close to the school. It might work, or it may just mean they park down the road. It may not necessarily increase active commuting from home to school, but certainly it's an intervention that could work, and it's worth trying in combination with all these other things. Multifactorial approaches, I think, is the answer.
Thanks.
Final presentation, just to introduce myself.
My name is Faulkner. I'm in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education here in Toronto. I don't sound exactly like a local boy. I've spent far too much time in Australia and England, but so I do sound a little bit kind of mid-Atlantic, so just forgive that. And so I'm going to really talk about your approach that is common in Canada, school travel planning. And again, you kind of chose to kind of finish up the presentations with this one because it potentially can incorporate everything that we've heard. That potentially it could incorporate walking school buses, it could incorporate an educational kind of component, and it's kind of, as David kind of suggested as we were leaving, it's kind of multifactorial in nature. It's trying to address a number of different factors at once in many respects. So we know that obviously physical activity and the walk to school, to and from school, is an important leverage point. It can be an important source of physical activity. There may be a range of psychosocial benefits for kids actively traveling to and from school. And again, it's getting away from that extra screen time. The window screen is another form of screen time that perhaps we could envisage some important benefits. And of course, there are environmental benefits if we're reducing cars on the road and getting kids walking to and from school. And just a bit of Canadian context, I just wanted to show you an astounding figure which always kind of shocks me. This is in Ontario alone, but the amount of money that we spend on busing and the fuel costs for busing is quite astronomical. In 2011, 2012, it was estimated at just over $750 million annually was spent on busing children to and from school in Ontario. And just for this current year, it's now moved to $860 million. So that just seems, it's 4%, 5% of the education budget not being spent on educating kids. surely there is something that can be done here to look at clawing back some of this money to try to invest in some of the initiatives that we're all particularly interested in. So talk then about the school travel planning process and really about the Canadian history. And I think one of it's a strength and a limitation, but school travel initiatives in Canada, it's largely a grassroots initiative. It's done by NGOs, and that's great because I think we do need a kind of a bottom-up approach. It needs to come from the community. But again, I think there is also limits about what can be achieved through NGOs. But certainly one of the prominent ones, Green Communities Canada, really has led the work in school travel initiatives, in particular school travel planning, that started in 2006 with a review really of looking at interventions across the world to try to identify what might be an approach to be adopted in Canada. And really through that approach, school travel planning was chosen as the model. It was then pilot tested in 12 schools across 4 provinces in Canada, and then after that, Green Communities Canada was successful in receiving funding from the coalitions linking action and science for prevention to try to roll this out to 120 schools across Canada, without not a lot of pilot working. But suddenly we went from 0 to 120 in a couple of years. So what do we mean by school travel planning? So it's based on travel demand management principles, and really it kind of incorporates a couple of important features. One, it's a very flexible approach. It's trying to suggest that individual schools will have unique barriers to walking or cycling to school. So again, it may not be that a walking school bus always makes sense, or it may not be that we need to bother with educational initiatives in some cases. It depends on what is going on in the ground at a particular school. So it's very context specific and it's very flexible. The other kind of important feature of it is that it's very community based. And that an important feature of it is trying to develop a community of individuals, a community of stakeholders who have a concern and an interest in travel issues at a particular school and trying to do something about it. So an important part is getting together a school travel plan committee that has stakeholders, that has kids, that has parents, that has educators, that perhaps have representatives from police, planners, traffic engineers, everyone who perhaps can have some kind of leverage on addressing the barriers at a particular school. So the school travel planning process ultimately ends up with this document that is developed, outlining what are the barriers at this particular school, what are the strategies that we are going to approach. It starts with a setup, typically, and certainly in the case of this national project, school travel plan facilitators are hired who look after a number of different schools, perhaps in a province or in a particular area. They help get the school travel plan committee together, try to bring the stakeholders together through a series of meetings, start to kind of go through this process of assessment. And so again, the schools are part of the evaluation, that they collect the rudimentary measures, that they spend a week at the beginning of the school year, every school class being asked, how did you get to school? Hands up if you were driven, hands up if you walked, and the teacher records that information. There's a survey that goes out to parents that asks them about how do their kids usually get to school, what are the barriers that you face, what kind of solutions would you like to see. There is a school walkabout, so the school travel plan committee and also perhaps the school itself actually kind of engage in the process of looking at, what again the barriers that we face that we need to try to find solutions for. This then goes together, forms a document that outlines the strategies to be taken, and then that leads to its implementation, and eventually you go through this data collection process again. Typically at the end of the school year, is there a change in mode share? Are there any changes to the environment? Are we happy with how things are going? Do we need to modify it? And so on. So that's the kind of the strategy, the SDP process. And again, each school may then kind of select from a range of different options depending on what they see as important. So there may be more common educational approaches, flyers sent home, workshops for parents, perhaps some engagement with the curriculum, either through physical education or through some of the eco-schools initiatives talking about the environment. It's about educating parents and children about school travel issues. There are activities and events that are quite common. So even on next Monday is Bike to School Day in Toronto District School Board. So these are kind of events that are held across among schools or across school boards that are promoting cycling to school, promoting walking to school. There may also be capital improvement plans, so actually kind of modifying, if needed, infrastructure around schools, looking at calming measures, looking at infrastructures of sidewalk coverage. And there also may be enforcement, so looking at individuals that can be used to help kind of kids cross the road, so parking. I used to call it, it's terrible, I forgot the name, it used to be called lollipop ladies in Australia growing up. Crossing guards, thank you. So I'm now going to look at, talk more then about this kind of, again, this effectiveness study, which was conducted, originally 120 schools was planned, but ended up looking really at 106 schools in every province and nearly every territory. And this paper has just been published in Preventive Medicine, and certainly this is a good time to acknowledge George Mammon, who was key in doing this work, Michelle Stone, and Subha Ramanathan, who were helping out with this evaluation. And this is where it gets messy. I mean, I think, going back to what Jason said, it's hard to do this kind of rigorous evaluation of school-based interventions, and it becomes even harder to do so at a national level. So we started looking at these 120 schools. That was the plan. But really, when we looked at, firstly, the hands-up data, we were very interested in linking the hands-up data to the actual school travel plan. So looking at the documents produced by schools and trying to link changes in mode share in terms of what schools actually did. But we only ended up with 56 schools where we had complete data. And we'll talk about a number of reasons why that was the case. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that data and then finish up by looking at the parent survey data at the end of the intervention, which was actually at 103 schools. And a lot of this evaluation, we were also interested in trying to identify where does this work? Are there kind of certain types of schools where school travel planning seems to be more effective? And that could be related to where schools are, the size of the schools, the season of data collection, and so on. In terms of what schools were actually doing, I think this was encouraging for us to see that I kind of expected it to be more educational in nature, the stuff that's pretty simple, not simple, but straightforward and cheap to do. But the biggest content of most of the school travel plans were actually capital improvements. So actual modifications in some shape or form to the built environment. And I think that's really encouraging, but also, I think that type of stuff probably is more likely to have some kind of legacy which has an impact 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the line, but perhaps we're not necessarily going to see at the end of 1 year. So that was certainly an encouraging sign to start with. I've lost my animation, so you won't see the exciting kind of reveal here of what we saw in terms of the hands-up data. So again, this is pre and post, asking kids, how did you get to and from school? At the beginning of the intervention, it was 27%. At the end of the intervention, it was 27%. Same thing with the follow-up, and so we'll come back to this issue, this time shifting. Certainly in Canada, we always see an increase in natural increase in walking home from school. But again, 31% follow-up walking home, and that did not change at all. So that is kind of a bit disheartening to start with, but again, it perhaps is a bit unfair to look, you're trying to kind of aggregate all of these different schools. And again, the whole nature of school travel planning is that it's very kind of individual in nature, that it's very unique, and it perhaps kind of gives an unfair picture. And when you look at the actual kind of school level variability, there was actually an increase in walking to school in at least half of the 56 schools that we examined in this data. So there is evidence of localized success using this data, but tremendous range. So we saw some schools declining in walking to school up to 26%, while some schools were increasing up to 23%. And of course, when you average this out, you find nothing. So what is going on there? And again, we look at trying to predict, well, what variables seem to be related to increases in walking, if any. And it didn't seem to have anything to do with the action plans, what was going on in terms of the school travel plans. It didn't matter whether it was central Canada, east or west, the socioeconomic neighbourhood of schools, the age of the dwellings or the school size. What it came down to, one of the most, the only significant predictor was the actual season of data collection. And that kind of was threw us in a bit of a kind of a loop. What the hell is going on here? And of course, what we found was many schools were actually collecting their follow-up data in the winter season. So they collected their baseline data in September and then collected their follow-up data in winter. So this is kind of reflecting, again, what kind of David showed, a kind of seasonal decline. And then we talked to schools, well, what is going on there? Like, you're not supposed to do that. And it all kind of boiled down to just funding constraints, that in order for schools to receive funding to do the project, they receive a lot of pressure to finish their data collection before it was actually due. So again, it's kind of an artificial kind of finding in a way that just suggested that in some schools, the intervention wasn't really given enough time to examine. More encouraging is looking at the parental data. So this is parents receiving surveys at 103 schools in this instances at the end of the intervention, and looking at self-reporting, have they changed their mode to and from school. Encouragingly, just under 17% of the parents sampled said that they were driving less, and of those, the majority, so 1,000 households are self-reporting that their kids are walking to school. So that's much better. So this is an example of kind of interrogating the data to try to find something that is at least a positive news story. But I think this is, when we look at the number of households, that this represents roughly a 4% mode shift of the nearly 25,000 households that were in the survey. I think that's actually relatively promising in comparison to travel intervention studies. And is actually kind of on a par with research in New Zealand after 3 years demonstrating a 1.7% increase in walking. A little bit more insight here when we looked at, well, what are the predictors of mode change amongst the parents who are self-reporting here? And again, there are some factors that I think probably are, again, not surprising. Child age, that the older the kid was, the older the child in the household, they were more likely to change to walking. When the households were relatively close to schools, the closer they were to the school, again, they were more likely to be responsive to this school travel planning initiative. So perhaps they had the capacity, or the conditions were more conducive to make that shift. More likely in urban schools and then suburban schools in comparison to rural schools. And also more likely in medium SES neighbourhoods as opposed to low and high. And that may be that in the low neighbourhood schools, again, the relatively high number of kids already walking or cycling to school. So perhaps not a lot, a bit of a kind of a ceiling effect. Maybe in the high SES schools, we think they're just more resistant to change. So I think that's, again, partly what we're interested in is that, again, maybe this isn't, even SDP, school travel planning, isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, but it makes sense in some schools as opposed to others. Clearly, infrastructure improvements were rated as the most important kind of component of school travel planning amongst the parents, as well as safety education. So just to finish that part, so some mixed evidence for benefit. So when we look at that, the children data, not as promising. That is in a smaller number of schools. It perhaps doesn't give us a full picture. But there was even still some evidence of localized success, that half of the schools reported an increase in walking to and from school. Parental self-report, I think, is certainly more promising, reports a 4% increase, but again, of course, that is self-report in nature. But I think there are certainly some limitations to be aware of. Certainly that's just in terms of the limited resources to support this intervention. So again, I talk about this being largely an NGO grassroots initiative. Schools were given $1,000 to support active school travel planning initiatives. That is, to me, is a very modest amount of money. So again, it's very much reliant on the school champion, very much on the school committee to get things done. And perhaps the lack of kind of finance funding does limit what schools can actually do. Short-term timeline, and again, unfortunately, an inability to be more rigorously evaluate these things in terms of no-control schools, convenient sampling in terms of the schools that participated, reliance on self-reporting data, and inconsistent data collection. I now just want to kind of finish then by talking a little bit about some other work that we've done. At the same time as we were kind of asked to help out evaluating that project, we were also involved in our own more focused research looking at the built environment and school travel in the GTA, in Toronto. And I think in doing this work, we kind of really picked on a couple of important lessons that we weren't really seeing reflected in a lot of the school travel planning documents that we came across. And so I just wanted to kind of finish by talking about some of these lessons. And I think the one I want to start with first is one of gender that I'm becoming increasingly interested in. This is my daughter, Ryan, who looks like a bit of an Oompa Loompa. But what we find, certainly in Canada, and it was interesting that some data earlier today that in Ireland it wasn't the case, there's a clear gender difference in walking to and from school in Canada that reflects gender disparities in physical activity. And so if we really want to if we want to increase children walking to and from school, then we also have to really tackle this gender issue. But I think we're sometimes perhaps a little less kind of open to talking about what of course is a very complex issue about how do we get around different kind of concerns about the independent mobility of girls as opposed to boys. But certainly in the Toronto area, we see something like a 10 to 15% difference between the number of boys and girls walking. And so I think that's one issue that we really need to tackle and really need to think about. And I'm certainly interested to hear your thoughts. There's the issue of time, and this is the time cost. And so there was a question about convenience, and of course you've heard Mark Tremblay talking about this culture of convenience. Well, I think this is a case where school travel is an issue of convenience. That this is just some data, again, going back to the school travel planning data, and this is about reasons for, well, why am I still driving my kid to school, even though I live within 1.5 kilometres? And so these wasn't most salient were issues of safety. They were still important, but were more salient were issues of convenience and time, train, I'm on my way to somewhere else, so trip chaining. And again, the school travel planning documents don't really kind of tackle this issue of convenience. They tend to be much more about, again, broader safety education issues, which are important, but not necessarily explicitly making walking more convenient and making perhaps driving less convenient. There's also this fascinating issue that I've always been interested in, is this mode shifting. And I was interested with David's presentation where they didn't find anything going on in the afternoon. And I think in Canada, and again in the GTA, we see something, and in Ontario, something like a 5 to 10% shift where kids who are being driven in the morning are suddenly walking home in the afternoon. And so it may be that it's because you're not seeing anything happening because the majority of them are actually kind of starting, are already walking. So again, does this mean that how do we tailor our intervention? Perhaps we need to really focus on the AM period. Look at how those kids who seem to be walking in the afternoon, and look at, well, how do we kind of help them perhaps become more active in those morning periods? Again, maybe this is an easier point for leverage that has an important impact on mode share. And the final kind of issue is just one of space. And again, this is some of our kind of more traditional work looking at active school travel, the built environment in Toronto, and looking at different types of correlates and looking at associations between those correlates at the home end and also at the school end. And certainly some of our data seems to suggest that it's what you see outside your front door that's more important in terms of how you get to and from school. So not so much the built environment around the school, but the built environment around the home that seems to be important. Again, that's not to say the built environment around the school isn't important, but that's what the focus of much school travel planning is. It's really at the school end of the trip journey, whereas school travel planning probably needs to look into, or try to think about, how can we be much more broader in scope and look at, well, where are kids actually coming from? Perhaps we need to also address that. And this is just an interesting paper where we were just looking at the clustering of walking to and from school. This is again in the GTA area. The red spots are where there's lots of kids already walking and cycling to and from school. The orange, or the darker orange, this is where high rates of walking just in the morning, and the lighter orange or yellow is only in the PM. The white bits, there's not much going on whatsoever. But I'd like to kind of show this just to really demonstrate both the spatial and temporal kind of heterogeneity of mode share and how kids get to and from school. That again, that it's very different in different locations. And so certainly a one-size-fits-all solution is not possible. But at the same time, how does school travel planning take this complexity into account? So in terms of the SDP future, and again, I guess this is more from a research perspective, some of the earlier presentations this afternoon, a lot of SDP work is still going on. And I still think that it's probably perhaps the best approach, best process to tackle the unique challenges facing schools, that you do need this kind of flexible model that schools can apply in a way that's most appropriate for their context. And again, it's really hard to also, as picking up on David said, the importance of qualitative research. We've got a mountain of qualitative research that attests to how beneficial school travel planning exercises are in specific schools. And in many respects, that's perhaps the best outcome of this type of process, is it really does build community, school community capacity to think about school travel issues and to kind of try to do something about it. But again, I don't know if school travel planning is right for every school. I think in some schools it perhaps is too much time, it's too much effort, it's too resource intensive, and really we need to figure out perhaps which schools are more likely to respond positively. And I'd like to see them develop much more of an explicit focus, thinking about girls and independent mobility of girls, looking at the spatial variation and issues of convenience and time. And certainly what we're trying to do, and again George is trying to do, is a much more in-depth case study evaluation. So going back to basics, we started off at this national level, but now trying to kind of document in a much more rigorous fashion, what is happening at a school level. And certainly thank you to the funders for this research, so Green Communities Canada, CHR, Heart and Stroke, and CLASS.